When the air turned cold, there were afternoons in that nursing home when no one heard her footsteps. Not because she was weak, but because she had learned how to slip past people without disturbing a thing. But that day, there was something different about the silence, something heavier. An old man wheeled himself slowly down the hallway, hunched, cautious. He stopped in front of room 12A and peeked in. It was empty, not the kind of empty you expect, but the kind that shouldn't be. Where'd she go? No one answered. The young nurse avoided his eyes. The floor manager was suddenly on a call. And the emergency call button inside the room had been blinking red for over 2 hours. A week later, she was gone. They said it was natural causes. But her granddaughter, N, didn't buy it and had grown up with her grandma. Slept in her bed, shared her superstitions, knew every stubborn wrinkle on her face. And she knew one thing: Grandma never left quietly. While packing up her things and found a small metal box under the mattress. Inside wasn't jewelry. Not a single letter. Just a USB drive taped with a crooked handwritten note. If I die and no one cries, make damn sure they explain why. And plugged it in. Inside were nearly 70 video clips, grainy, tilted. Each one just a few minutes long. The footage was rough, the audio cracked, but what it captured was crystal clear. A scream, a slap, a voice telling her to shut up and stay down. A night on the cold tile floor, no one came. And suddenly, and understood, the cold in Grandma's room wasn't from winter, it was from people. People who saw her suffering and chose not to. But Grandma, somehow, she saw it coming. She prepared for it. She fought back. The kind of work that ate her soul. She didn't belong there. Not really. Not as a resident. Not even as staff. But that's where she ended up, folding towels in the back room of River Pines Care Facility, a half-hour outside Stockton, California. Miss Han had once been a teacher. She raised 2 daughters on substitute paychecks and pho sold out the back door on weekends. She didn't break easy, but when her youngest moved away and the house got too quiet, she took the job. Said she wanted to keep busy, said it was just until spring. But spring never came, not in that place. At first, the job felt almost noble. She liked caring for the old ones. She brushed their hair. She heated their soup bowls twice so the broth stayed warm longer. She held their hands when no one else did. But the kindness she gave out didn't come back. The place smelled wrong, not just the bleach and meds. There was a stale kind of fear in the halls, like everyone knew something they weren't allowed to say. Then came the small things. Pills going missing. An old woman who stopped talking after her roommate fell and disappeared overnight. Staff whispering in Tagalog when a patient cried too loudly. The laundry cart that suddenly had blood-stained gowns more than once a week. She reported one thing, just one: a man with deep bruises around his ribs. The director smiled too wide and said, "We appreciate your concern, Miss Han, but maybe stick to towels, okay?" The next week, they changed her schedule. Graveyard shifts, no more direct contact with residents, just folding. Alone, then came the wet floor. She slipped outside the supply closet at 2:14 a.m., lay there staring at the ceiling for nearly 46 minutes. She knew the number exactly, because she watched the clock across the hallway blink every slow, humiliating second. When someone finally came, it wasn't a nurse. It was the janitor, and all he said was, "You good?" before walking off. The next morning, her name was missing from the staff lunch list. Her badge wouldn't scan, but they hadn't fired her. Not officially, just erased her slowly. That's when she stopped humming. That's when she started watching. She noticed a pattern. The patients without visitors got treated the worst. If no one called, no one cared, they left Mr. Anderson in a soaked bed 2 nights in a row. They slapped the Vietnamese lady in 4C when she screamed too long during her hallucinations. They told the woman in 3B her son was too busy to come. even though he sat outside in the parking lot every Tuesday and was turned away. Hanh began to keep notes, then dates, then names. She wrote small and taped things to the inside of her locker. Then one day, after she caught a nurse yanking an old man by the neck of his gown, she did something different. She went to Walmart, bought a cheap keychain camera, sewed it into the hem of her brown cardigan, tested it once in the break room. It worked. No one noticed, because by now no one looked at her at all. And still, she kept coming to work. Even when they shortened her hours, even when they left her name off the schedule, even when they stopped saying hello. She came in anyway, sat in the hall, folded towels no one asked for. Because the longer she stayed invisible, the more they showed their true selves. It got worse at night. The lights dimmed at 10 p.m., the screams got louder, the clocks never stopped, but they never helped either. The clock that didn't wait. At River Pines, time didn't move like it did on the outside. It ticked on walls, blinked on microwaves, hummed in IV pumps, but it didn't care. Not if you needed help, not if you were in pain. And definitely not if your name wasn't written on a family visit schedule. For Miss Hanh, the worst part wasn't the screaming. It was how the clock just kept going, no matter what. On her third night shift back-to-back, she heard it again, room 3B a thud, then a silence so sharp it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. She waited, 10 seconds, then 20. No one moved, no one called it in. So she got up. Room 3B was dark, the kind of dark that hospitals avoid, intentional like a punishment. She opened the door slowly. Inside, the old woman was lying half off the bed, nightgown tangled, arm bent wrong. Miss Hanh called for help, twice, no answer. She pressed the emergency button. The red light blinked. She watched it blink 47 times before someone finally walked in. A nurse chewing gum like she was bored. "She does this all the time," the nurse muttered, lifting the woman by the armpits like she was laundry. Just looking for attention. Miss Hanh stared, didn't blink, not because she was shocked anymore, but because she was recording. That night, she watched the playback in the laundry room. The footage was shaky, but the audio was clear. She saved it in a folder named Wednesday. The next night, she made a new folder, and the night after that, another, each one with a date, each one with a face, each one with someone who had waited too long for help that never came. She started timing everything, from when a patient pressed their buzzer to when someone showed up. If they showed up at all, room 4C. 19 minutes, room 2A, no one came. The man had a seizure on the floor. She printed the timestamps, highlighted them, slipped copies under doors, but they disappeared by morning, like dust. Then something strange happened. The clock started changing. Not on the walls, on the cameras. Footage that was there one day would vanish the next. Sometimes the timestamps didn't match what she remembered. A video she knew started at 10. 17 p.m. was suddenly labeled 12, 3 a.m. Someone had noticed, and someone was watching her back. She didn't panic. She started making copies on 2 drives, then 3. One she kept under her pillow. Another she mailed to Anne's address with no return name, just in case, because by now she understood time didn't protect anyone in that place, and no one was coming to save her. But one night, the call button in room 5A never lit up at all. And that, more than any bruise or scream or insult, was the moment she snapped. The bruises they called accidents. It started with fingertips, tiny, dark smudges blooming across forearms, around wrists, behind shoulders. One nurse said it was fragile skin. Another blamed blood thinners. When Mr. Alvarez's eye turned purple for a week, someone casually claimed, he fell asleep on his glasses. But Miss Hanh had raised 2 daughters. She knew the difference between clumsy and covered-up cruelty. She first noticed it with Mrs. Connors, a sweet 92-year-old who used to hum Frank Sinatra down the hallway, until one day she didn't. That morning, the staff wheeled her into the laundry room by mistake. Her arms were marked up, fingers swollen, her bottom lip split. "What happened?" Han asked. The aide didn't blink. "She bit herself," she said, and then she laughed. "Old people get weird like that." That night, Miss Han reviewed the hallway footage. At 2:41 a.m., Mrs. Connors stood unsteady outside the dining room. At 2:43, someone in scrubs shoved her hard. No face on camera, just a thick hand grabbing too tightly. She brought the clip to the head nurse the next morning. No accusations, just played it straight from her drive. When the video ended, the nurse lined back. "If you show that to anyone, Miss Han," she said coldly, "you won't just lose your little towel job, you'll be trespassed for life." Then came the smile. "And if you're banned, who's gonna protect your little friends out there?" That same afternoon, Mrs. Connors was relocated to the memory unit. No goodbye, just disappeared behind a locked door. Han didn't sleep that night or the next. She wandered the halls like a ghost, eyes scanning every wrist, every limp, every quiet wince. "Accidents happen," they said, but why did they always happen to the same ones? The quiet ones, the ones nobody visited. She didn't scream. She didn't cry, she just sewed a second camera, this time inside her winter coat, and began recording staff conversations in the break room. That's where she caught it. Two aides joking over leftover pizza. "Did you see her face when I dropped her tray?" One said. "Smells like mothballs and guilt," the other replied. No names, but they didn't need names. The malice was enough. She made a new folder on the drive, called it Staff Attitudes. She started logging tone, expressions, patterns, because by now she understood bruises were only part of the abuse. The real sickness was deeper, colder. Then came Friday night, a knock on her door at 11 p.m. It wasn't staff. It was a resident, barefoot, shivering, eyes wide with panic. She whispered, "Miss Han, they locked me in the shower on purpose." And just like that, the bruises weren't just signs anymore. They were warnings, and time was running out. The eyes that started avoiding hers. By her 4th month at River Pines, something subtle began to shift. People stopped looking at her, not out of rudeness, but out of fear. Staff who used to nod in the hallway now stared past her like she wasn't there. Even the janitor, who once offered her half his sandwich on Fridays, suddenly changed his route to avoid the laundry room. It wasn't just distance. It was retreat, like they knew. She'd catch them glancing at her cardigan, her coat, the way she placed it carefully on the chair facing the hallway. One night, during a shift switch, she walked past the break room and caught her name. Just a whisper, followed by silence and a door slowly closing. She tried not to let it get to her, but even some residents had started pulling away. Mr. Alvarez, once grateful for the extra blanket she brought him at night, now kept his eyes glued to the TV whenever she entered. The woman from 4C, the one who used to clutch her hand during storms, began shaking her head when Han approached. A slow, terrified no, as if saying yes might get them both hurt. And that's when she realized they weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she saw. They had learned the rules of the place, the unspoken ones. Don't ask too many questions. Don't linger in the hallway after dark. Don't call twice in one night. And most of all, don't get noticed. Han was breaking all of that just by watching. Then came the memo, printed in Comic Sans, posted in the break room like a joke. It read, "Effective immediately, all staff personal items are subject to random inspection. This includes jackets, bags, and unauthorized electronic devices. Thank you for helping us maintain safety and HIPAA compliance." She didn't need to ask. She knew exactly who it was aimed at. That night, she left her coat accidentally in the lost and found. Camera still inside. When she came back the next day, it was gone. But when she checked the mailbox at her granddaughter's apartment later that week, the backup drive was still safe and had signed for it without asking questions. Smart girl, just like her mother. Then something even stranger happened. One of the aides, Tina, the one who used to act like she didn't care about anything, stopped her in the hallway. Her voice was low, her hands shook slightly. "I heard what you're doing," Tina said. "They're gonna come down on you hard." Miss Hand stared at her, said nothing. Tina hesitated, then added, "But if you're gonna keep watching, look at room 2D. Night shift, that's all I'm saying." And just like that, she walked away. It was the first act of kindness Han had received from staff in weeks. It terrified her, because if Tina was warning her, then things were worse than she thought. That night, she watched 2D from a distance. At 2:17 a.m., a nurse entered. The door didn't close all the way. Han saw shadows move across the floor, then a hand raise, and a sudden, jerking motion that made her gasp. The resident didn't cry, didn't scream, just flinched like it wasn't new. She recorded all of it. Labeled the file 2D no sound. Because silence, she realized, had become its own language in that place. The next morning, when she went to check on the woman in 2D, she found her bed stripped and empty. The nameplate was gone. She asked a nurse, "Where is she?" The nurse paused, then smiled. "Discharged, family picked her up." Her hand nodded, but her stomach turned, because she knew something the nurse didn't. That woman had no family. Not one visitor, not one card, not even a birthday cake. And just like that, Han understood the new pattern. The ones they feared most didn't get punished. They disappeared, so she made another decision. She wouldn't just record what was happening. She would start naming names in a folder labeled Final. The night she screamed without a sound. The temperature dropped on a Friday. Not outside. Stockton was still thick with early spring heat, but inside room 12A, the air turned unnaturally cold. Miss Hand felt it the moment she stepped in. The radiator wasn't working again. The blankets were damp. The window latch was broken, rattling with every gust. She reported it twice. No one came. By 10 p.m., the cold had seeped through her cardigan, into her fingers, her knees, her chest. Her breath fogged up her reading glasses. The hallway lights dimmed on schedule. A nurse peeked in, saw her shivering, and left without saying a word. She wrapped herself in a towel from the laundry, sat on the floor, waited at 1:04 a.m., the pain started. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow pressure blooming behind her ribs, crawling up her spine. Her fingers went numb, her neck stiffened. Her jaw clenched tight against the wave of something old and ugly. Panic, maybe? Something she hadn't felt since hiding in a bomb shelter as a child. She pressed the call button. Nothing. She pressed it again, then again, still nothing, no beep. No red light, only silence. And cold. She tried to scream. Her mouth opened, her body leaned forward. But nothing came out, not even a whisper. Her voice had frozen somewhere between rage and oxygen. The kind of scream that tears itself in two before it leaves the throat. And in that moment, on the floor of that room that smelled like bleach and forgetfulness, Miss Hand felt it. She could die here. And no one would notice until breakfast. But something in her refused. She crawled slowly with shaking limbs across the tile, pulled herself up by the metal bed frame, reached for the camera sewn into the hem of her cardigan. Red light, blinking, recording, she looked directly into it. Didn't speak, just held up her hand, 3 fingers raised. It wasn't a signal. It was a memory. 3 seconds was how long it took, years ago, for her husband to pull her out of the river when she fell through the ice. 3 seconds between sinking and being saved. Tonight she gave herself the same. She counted 1, 2, 3, and then she moved. She used the edge of the nightstand to hoist herself up, knocked over a tray. Shattered the plastic pitcher on the floor, made noise finally, enough that someone might come just to shut her up. At 1:28 a.m., a nurse appeared, rolled her eyes. "You again? Jesus, what now?" As she didn't answer, just pointed to the call button. The nurse looked confused, pressed it. Nothing, no light, no sound. "Oh," she muttered, suddenly uncomfortable. "That's weird." They replaced the button the next day, quietly. No report, no paperwork, no apology. But Han kept the old one, wrapped it in a hand towel, and placed it in the bottom of her drawer. Evidence. That night changed something in her, not because she was scared, but because, for the first time, she knew they didn't care if she died. Not out of hatred, not even cruelty, just indifference. And that, she realized, was worse than hate. She updated the folder, added a new one, malfunctions intentional. Then she made a voice recording, simple, calm. "On March 18th, I pressed the emergency button 7 times between 1, 4 and 1:27 a.m. No response. Nurse on duty was Kelly D. I believe the button was disabled intentionally. She sent that one to N. No explanation, just labeled it, in case something happens to me." The next morning, she found her laundry cart had been reassigned, her towel hooks removed, her locker emptied. No one said it out loud. But the message was clear: you're no longer welcome. But we won't fire you, because we don't want questions. That night she stayed anyway, not to work, not to help. She sat in the hallway with her cardigan zipped up to her chin, the camera still blinking, waiting for something worse, and it came, but not to her. The button that never called help. The call buttons had always been broken. Sometimes they blinked without sound. Sometimes they lit up but connected to nowhere. And sometimes, like in her own room that night, they simply went dead, as if someone had unplugged them from mercy itself. But Miss Han had always thought it was just neglect, budget cuts, apathy. Until the night in room 7D, it started with a sound she wasn't supposed to hear. She was folding sheets in the back storage area, where the walls were thin and the vents carried everything. 2 aides were talking on the other side, laughing. She pressed it 10 times last night. "Yeah, still breathing this morning." "Barely," Nurse K said. "Leave her. Clock out early, let the new shift deal with it." Damn. Pause, then quieter. "Boss said it's better that way anyway. Low resource cases, you know." Low resource. She'd never heard the term used like that before. Not for a person. Not for a human being lying in a hospital bed pressing a button for help in the dark. That night she stayed late, slipped into 7D during shift change. The old woman inside, Mrs. Bell, was conscious, barely. Her breathing was ragged, her pillow soaked, her fingers shaking. Hand touched her arm gently. Whispered, "Did you press the button?" Mrs. Bell blinked, then nodded just once. Han walked over to the call device. She pressed it. Nothing. She opened the wall panel where it connected. The cable had been snipped. Clean. This wasn't laziness. This wasn't a system too overwhelmed to care. This was deliberate. She reported it to the night supervisor. Brought the cut wire in her hand. The supervisor looked down at it, then looked up with a smile so blank it chilled her more than the cold tile floors. "We'll get maintenance to look at that. Thanks, Han." No note was taken. No clipboard, no urgency. That wire would vanish before morning, just like Mrs. Bell. She didn't wait this time. She pulled out her phone, photographed the cut. The room, the patient's vitals. Even the nurse login screen left open at the station, showing no nurse had checked room 7D in over 6 hours. Then she went home early. That was new. She copied the files, wrote a letter. Mailed it to an address she hadn't used in years. A former student who now worked for the local paper in Modesto. No explanation, just the words, "If I disappear, start here." But she didn't disappear. Something worse happened. They pretended she didn't exist. The following week, she came in and found her time card removed. Her nameplate gone. her locker reassigned. No formal firing, just absence, forced invisibility. That's when she realized the system had learned to erase people before the paperwork even began. They didn't yell, didn't threaten, they just stopped answering. And slowly, even the patients followed. Because when your lifeline is a button that never calls help, you stop believing anyone's coming. She tried to reach the Department of Health, left messages, no response. She tried emailing the nursing board, emails bounced. She tried calling the ombudsman listed on the flyer in the lobby. The line rang 4 times, then disconnected. She wasn't fighting bad people anymore. She was fighting a fog. A slow, quiet machine designed not to kill, but to erase without leaving a mess. That's when she made the real decision. No more collecting. It was time to expose, publicly, violently if necessary. She didn't want revenge. She wanted memory. She wanted these people to never forget what they did when no one was watching. She took the last clean cardigan in her closet and sewed the camera into the hem, a tighter fit, better angle. This one wouldn't just watch, it would see everything. The camera in her hem. By the time she sewed the final camera into the hem of her cardigan, Miss Han knew 3 things with certainty. First, no one in that place was going to save her. Second, everything she recorded might still vanish if she didn't control the story herself. And third, if she wanted the truth to matter, she'd have to make it hurt the right people. So she stopped hiding. She wore the brown cardigan every day, sat in hallways longer than her shift, hung around the nurses' station, asked questions she already knew the answers to just to catch the tone in their voices, just to watch who looked nervous. She recorded everything, not just violence. Neglect, laughter, sarcasm, cruelty, gaslighting. The aide who lied about a patient's blood sugar then took her smoke break while the woman seized. The supervisor who wrote down checked vitals on a man who had already died that morning. The nurse who mocked an old black veteran for calling out to his mother in his sleep. She didn't flinch. She just folded towels, straightened bed sheets, and waited for patterns to show. They did. The same 3 people were always on shift during the worst nights. One of them, she suspected, was feeding information upward, not to management, but higher, to whoever was making the decision to cut call lines, disappear patients, and fake family pickups. She didn't know the name yet, but she had a smell for rot. This rot had a face. She just hadn't seen it yet. What she did see, though, was fear. People had started to whisper her name again, but now it came with respect and distance. Don't talk around her. She's the one with the camera. Be careful, she's sending stuff out. It was working, not because she felt powerful, but because they felt exposed. But that's when something changed. One afternoon, someone slid a note under her door. No envelope, just 3 words: stop or vanish. No signature, no name, but the message was clear. She sat with the note in her lap for a long time, didn't cry, didn't react. Just thought, if they knew how much I've already sent, they'd know it's too late. What they didn't know was this: she hadn't just been sending video. She had also mailed a timeline. Names, shifts, reassignments. Budget memos she photocopied from the break room printer when no one was watching. She knew what the state needed. It wasn't just emotion. It was evidence plus failure plus timeline plus pattern. They taught her that during the war, how to spot systemic rot hiding behind small crimes. Then came the test. One night, a nurse, Kelly D., came to her room after hours, alone, holding a small tray. "I brought tea," she said, smiling. Too wide, Miss Han said nothing, took the cup, set it aside. The nurse lingered. "You always drink it." Han didn't look up. "Not tonight." The nurse stared at her, then shrugged. Left. Later, Han dumped the tea into the sink. It smelled faintly of almond. She bagged the cup and mailed it out. Same day, No return address, just one sentence written on the flap: "If I'm dead, test this." By then, even the good staff had stopped helping, not out of malice, but survival. Tina, the aide who once warned her, now looked the other way. Her hands always shook. Han didn't blame her. "Do what you need to do," she whispered once when their hands brushed passing a chart, and Han nodded, not with anger, with understanding. Because she had stopped expecting anyone to fight beside her. She just needed them not to get in her way. She began wearing the camera cardigan to church, to Anne's apartment, to the grocery store. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was broadcasting. If she disappeared, she wanted 100 threads pointing back. She recorded a final message, too. One last clip, not for YouTube, not for the press, but for her granddaughter. In it, she sat in her chair, cardigan zipped up to the neck, eyes clear. "Don't grieve long, Con. Use what I left. Make them explain themselves in public." She looked straight into the lens. "Don't let this die quietly. I didn't." The next morning, she dropped the last package in the mail. Inside were 2 drives, a printed index, and a post-it with one line: "One last story for your Sunday edition." She addressed it to the Modesto Times, @an investigations. Then she walked back to River Pines, clocked in, folded towels, and waited for the storm to come. After the funeral, a storm. The funeral was on a Wednesday, cloudless, too warm for March, and kept waiting for thunder, but none came. There were only 6 people, 4 from the family, 2 from the church, no one from River Pines. The priest said her name wrong, twice. Miss Han became Miss Han. The prayer was generic. The flowers were plastic. The dirt hit the coffin without weight. But when they handed in the folded cardigan, brown, worn, still faintly holding her grandmother's shape, that's when it started to rain. Not from the sky, from inside, because tucked inside the hem was a second flash drive. No label, just a small red sticker, and recognized it immediately. She'd seen it once before, on a USB her grandmother used to hide recipes from her mother. Only this time the recipe wasn't for pho. And went home, locked the door, turned off her phone, she plugged the drive in. Inside were folders, dozens of them, labeled by room number, date, staff initials. Each one filled with video, audio, screenshots, PDFs, even notes typed in broken English. There was a clip from 2A, a man falling from his bed, calling out for help for 23 minutes. One from 5C. An aide slapping a woman for soiling her sheets. Another from the break room: "She's old. She won't remember. Better if she dies soon." Freeze up a bed and threw up in the kitchen sink. At the bottom of the last folder, there was a recording labeled, "For you if they lie." She hit play. Her grandmother's face filled the screen. Not sad, not scared, just steady. "I knew they wouldn't protect me, so I protected myself. I knew they'd lie about what happened, so I left the truth behind." Don't be quiet, Con. You come from women who fight. The next day, and walked into the office of the Modesto Times. She didn't ask for an appointment. She didn't smile. She handed the editor a manila envelope and said, "If you ignore this, you're no better than them." The story broke 3 days later. The headline: "Grandmother dies in silence, leaves behind evidence of widespread abuse at local nursing home." And underneath it, a still image from the cardigan camera. Mrs. Bell's bruised hands, a call button duct taped to the wall. The internet exploded. TikTok stitched it. Reddit tore it apart. News vans parked outside River Pines within hours. The facility released a statement calling it isolated incidents. But then more families came forward. More names, more bruises, more disappearances. A second article dropped. Tapes reveal pattern of neglect and tampering, staff under investigation. Within a week, the director resigned. Within 2, River Pines shut down, and that should have felt like victory. But for N, it didn't. Because when she walked past her grandmother's empty chair at home, there was no victory, only absence, only the echo of a woman who had to die. So the truth could live, but the story didn't end there. Because 2 days after the shutdown, and received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a printed report from the Department of Health. No letter, no return address, just one sentence scribbled at the bottom. You weren't the only one she sent it to. That's when Anne realized her grandmother hadn't just planned for justice. She had calculated it, and somewhere in that folder, buried in the metadata, was a list of every state-run facility using the same supplier, the same software, the same silencing tactics. It was never just about River Pines. It was about the system that let it exist. And now, and had the match, the dry grass, the wind, all she had to decide was whether to strike. The letter she left burning. It took him 3 weeks to open the last envelope. Not the legal ones, not the ones from lawyers or state agencies. Those she read immediately, cataloged, color-coded, shared with journalists. But this one, the one with her name on the front in her grandmother's careful, looping handwriting, that one sat on her kitchen counter for 23 days, folded, untouched, because some things don't feel like paper, they feel like triggers. She opened it just past midnight, barefoot, trembling slightly, the way kids do when they read old diaries hoping they won't find out their parents were human. Inside was a single page. No salutation, no dear, no love. Just her grandmother's voice, printed out, line after line, quiet and sharpened like bone. I knew you'd keep going, but I need you to ask yourself something. What is the cost of finishing what I started? If you burn the house down, will you sleep inside the ashes? Or will you just become another version of them, wearing a cleaner name? I didn't do this so you, become a warrior. I did this so no one else would have to. If it ends with me, let it end. If it has to go further, make sure it's your fire, not mine. And folded the letter, lit a match, held it over the sink. She didn't cry, she didn't blow it out. She let it burn, not out of rage, but release, because some things aren't meant to be preserved. Some truths, once passed on, aren't meant to be carried. They're meant to change the person who receives them. The next morning, and declined a TV interview, she deleted her Twitter. She shut off her notifications. She walked into the Department of Health with no cameras, no hashtags, just the envelope of everything her grandmother didn't publish. The parts that weren't meant for noise. The parts that still could fix what was broken quietly, if anyone dared try. The agent behind the glass flipped through the first few pages, didn't smile, didn't blink. What do you want out of this? Anne stared for a moment, then said, nothing, except for no one else to have to die proving they deserved help. She left the rest on the counter, walked away. That night, she sat alone at her grandmother's old table, eating reheated rice, cardigan draped over the back of her chair. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was carrying a dead woman's war. She felt like she had buried something properly. Not a body, a burden, but even as she closed her eyes, even as sleep finally crept in, there was still one sound she couldn't quite let go of. A sound that had lived in her blood since the day the first video played. Not a scream, not a gasp, a quiet, rhythmic blink, the red light on a camera. Still watching. The sound that stayed. Weeks passed, the headlines faded. New scandals took their place. River Pines was boarded up. The letters stopped coming. Even the reporter from the Modesto Times moved on to a wildfire story up north. But some nights when the house got too quiet and would hear it again. That click, that soft blink, that invisible rhythm only she could recognize. She knew it wasn't real. There was no red light in the room, no cardigan on the hook. No camera waiting to catch what no one else wanted to see, but it was there. It echoed in small things. When she saw an old man left alone at the pharmacy, trying to remember his insurance number. When she passed a social worker yawning through a house call. When she scrolled past a news article titled Elder Neglect on the Rise, and no one seemed to comment. That sound lived inside her now. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Like a conscience, and sometimes and wondered, was it ever just a cardigan? Was it ever just one nursing home? Or had her grandmother seen something bigger all along? Not just a rotten building, but a society trained to look away. One night, and opened her grandmother's old laptop, the one she hadn't touched since the funeral. Inside was a folder she hadn't noticed before. It was labeled only, still blinking. She opened it. Inside, 4 short clips from 4 different facilities, different cities, different dates, and one final note. It doesn't stop with me, it starts with who listens. And then closed the laptop. She didn't cry. She didn't post it. She just sat still. Because some truths don't scream, some truths blink, and once you hear them, once you really hear them, you don't get to pretend silence is harmless anymore. Not ever again.